Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you're enjoying the conference so far as we kick off the big weekend. Today we have Eddie Kondo sensei talking about task interpretations and completions. Kondo sensei, you have the floor.
Task interpretation and completion. Writing instructions and learning strategies. What is writing or learning? What are writing instructions? What are learning strategies and learning outcomes? What are relationships between structures, forms, and meanings in writing? To this end, writing abilities would develop literacies and voice forms and meanings. Then, how can teachers control the individual differences? Should we teach everyone transfer? Why do we tend to teach structures many times although they have been already acquired? First, Bruner 1966 says his hypothesis is that instruction is an effort to assess or to shape goals. His definitions of goals are described. First, goals is featured by response from stimulus. Second, goals relies on issues that are in storage. Third, intellectual goals has possibilities through representations. Fourth, intellectual development is dependent on a system and interaction between a teacher and a learner. Fifth, teaching is mostly constructed by language. Sixth, finally, intellectual development is represented with capabilities through sequences and attention. He stressed the need for regulated instructions. A series of instructions. He insisted that the series of instructions should be prescriptive and normative. He showed the series from four views. First, a series of instructions should be focused on experiences. Second, a series of instructions should be constructed as knowledge. Third, a series of instructions should be based on sequences. Finally, a series of instructions should be put on rewards and punishment. His argument is that instruction consists of leading the learner through a sequence of statements and these statements of a program, or a body of knowledge that increases learner's ability to grasp, transform, and transfer what he is learning. In addition, on sequences, there are experiences of learning, development, and individual differences. However, intellectual development should be advanced in the interpretations of symbolic representation of the world. A visible growth from the side of teachers. For making a curriculum, research studies should define language abilities as what can be achieved at the processes of input and output. It might provide some doubts or proposals toward the language acquisition theories that are defined as ones of explicit and implicit size, from 3 months to 6 months. At 1 unit of textbooks the government gives, if there are summary writing activities of stories and tasks, what is an achievable point in doing that for language purposes we have? Then, can the interpretation of high school students be developed? Instructionism we have, usually. By the 20th century, all major industrialized countries offered formal schooling to all of their children. When these schools took shape in the 19th and 20th centuries, scientists didn't know very much about how people learn. Knowledge is a collection of facts about the world and procedures for how to solve problems. The goal of schooling is to get these facts and procedures into the student's head. Teachers know these facts and procedures, and their job is to transmit them to students. Simpler facts and procedures should be learned first, followed by progressively more complex facts and procedures. The way to determine the success of schooling is to test students to see how many of these facts and procedures they have acquired. This traditional vision of schooling is known as instructionism. Learning sciences, Sawyer. Learning science is an interdisciplinary field that studies teaching and learning. Learning sciences study learning in a variety of settings, including not only the more formal learning of school classrooms, but also the informal learning that takes place at home, on the job, and among peers. The goal of the learning sciences is to better understand the cognitive and social processes that result in the most effective learning, and to use this knowledge to design classrooms and other learning environments so that people learn deeply and more effectively. The traditional role of educational research has been to tell educators how to achieve their curriculum objectives. But when learning scientists went into classrooms, they discovered that schools were not teaching the deep knowledge that underlies intelligent performance. The learning sciences, Sawyer, constructivism, Piaget, in the 1970s and 1960s and 1970s, Piaget's writing became widely influential in American education. Piaget argued a radically different theory. Although children certainly possess less knowledge than adults, what's even more important to learning is that children's minds contain different knowledge structures than in adults' minds. In other words, children differ not only in the quantity of knowledge they possess, their knowledge is qualitatively different. Constructivism explains why students often do not learn deeply by listening to a teacher or reading from a textbook. Learning sciences research is revealing the different underlying basis of how knowledge construction works. To design effective learning environments, one needs a very good understanding of what children know when they come to the classroom. This requires sophisticated research into children's cognitive development, and the learning sciences rely heavily on psychological studies of cognitive development. The learning sciences, cognitive science. Many learning scientists began their careers in the interdisciplinary field known as cognitive science. Cognitive science combines experimental investigation of how the mind works with computational modeling of proposed mental processes, taking into account what we know from sociology and anthropology about how people use knowledge in everyday settings. Representation. Central to cognitive science is the idea that intelligent behavior is based on representations in the mind. Knowledge structures such as concepts, beliefs, facts, procedures, and models. Reflection. Studies of experts show they are better than novices at planning and criticizing their work, both reflective activities. Problem solving. Cognitive scientists have spent several decades attempting to identify the cognitive basis of problem solving. Thinking. Educators often talk about the importance of higher order thinking skills, but educational programs that emphasize thinking skills are often not based on scientific research. Inside the minds. Knowing how and knowing that. If to perform intelligently is to do one thing and not two things, and if to perform intelligently is to apply criteria in the conduct of the performance itself, it remains to show how this factor does characterize those operations which we recognize as skillful, prudent, tasteful, or logical. For these need be no visible or audible differences between an action done with skill and one done from sheer habit, blind impulse, or in a fit of absence of mind. The ability to apply rules is the product of practice. It is therefore tempting to argue that competences and skills are just habits. This distinction between habits and intelligent capacities can be illustrated by reference to the parallel distinction between the method used for inculcating the two sorts of second nature. We build up habits by drills, but we build up intelligent capabilities by training. The design of learning environment. New developments in the science of learning raise important questions about the design of learning environments. question that suggests the body of the thinking what is taught, how it is taught, and how it is assessed. Learner-centered environment. We use the term learner-centered to refer to environments that pay careful attention to the knowledge, skills, attitudes, and the beliefs that learners bring to the educational setting. A key strategy is to prompt children to explain and develop their knowledge structures by asking them to make predictions about various situations and explain the reason for their predictions. Learner-centered teachers also respect the language practices of their students because they provide a basis for further learning. Overall, learner-centered environments include teachers who are aware that learners construct their own meanings, beginning with the beliefs, understandings, and cultural practices they bring to the classroom. If teaching is conceived as constructing a bridge between the subject matter and student, learner-centered teachers keep a constant eye on both ends of the bridge. The teachers attempt to get a sense of what students know and can do as well as their interests and passions. What each student knows, cares, is able to do, and wants to do. Knowledge-centered environment. Environments that are solely learner-centered would not necessarily help students acquire the knowledge and skills necessary to function effectively in society. The ability of experts to think and solve problems is not simply due to a generic set of thinking skills or strategies, but instead requires well-organized bodies of knowledge that support planning and strategic thinking. Knowledge-centered environments intersect with learner-centered environments when instruction begins with the concern for student initial preconceptions about the subject matter. Knowledge-centered environments also focus on the kinds of information and activities that help students develop an understanding of disciplines. A challenge for the design of knowledge-centered environments is to strike the appropriate balance between activities designed to promote understanding and those designed to promote the automaticity of skills necessary to function effectively without being overwhelmed by attentional requirements. Students for whom it is effortful to read, write, and calculate can encounter serious difficulties learning. Assessment-centered environment. In addition to being learner-centered and knowledge-centered, effectively designed learning environments must also be assessment-centered. The key principles of assessment are that they should provide opportunities for feedback and revision, and that what is assessed must be congruent with one's learning goals. It is important to distinguish between two major uses of assessment. The first, formative assessment, involves use of assessment, usually administered in the context of the classroom, as sources of feedback to improving teaching and learning. The second, summative assessment, measures where students have learned at the end of some set of learning activities. Examples of formative assessment include teachers' comments on work in progress, such as draft of papers or preparation for presentations. Examples of summative assessment include teacher-made tests given at the end of a unit of study, and state and national achievement tests that students at the end of the year. Then we have to think of language acquisitions. The first language acquisition that is defined as monolingual. Second, a second language acquisition that is defined as bilingual. Finally, a third language acquisition that is defined as multilingual. Who speaks several languages, German, French, and Spanish. First, language acquisition. Children progress through a discovery of language in their first 3 years. There are prediction patterns in the emergence or development of many features of the language they are learning. To some extent, these stages in language acquisition are related to children's cognitive development. Brown and his colleagues find that a child who has mastered the grammatical mohammers at the bottom of the list had also mastered those at the top, but the reverse was not true. Thus, there was evidence for the developmental sequence or order of acquisition. However, the children did not acquire the mohammers at the same age or rate. Eve had mastered nearly all the mohammers before she was 2.5 years old, while Sarah and Adam were still working on them when they were 3.5 or 4. The order and acquisition theory, negation, has four stages. Stage 1, negation is usually expressed by the word no. No, no cookie, no come here. Stage 2, utterances grow longer and the sentence subject may be included. Daddy, no come here, don't touch that. Stage 3, the negative element is inserted into a more complex sentence. I can't do it, he don't want it. Stage 4, children begin to attach a negative element to the correct form of auxiliary verbs such as do and be. You didn't have supper. She doesn't want it. I don't have no more candies. Questions. The order of acquisitions of questions to embedded questions has 6 stages. Stage 1. Children's earliest questions are single words or simple 2 or 3 word sentences with rising intonation. Cookie, mommy, book. Where's daddy? What's that? Stage 2. As they begin to ask more new questions, children use the word the order of the declarative sentence. You like this, I have some. Stage 3. Gradually, children notice that the structure of questions is different and begin to produce questions. Can I go? Are you happy? Stage 4. Some questions are formed by subject or auxiliary inversion. Are you going to play with me? Do dogs like ice cream? Stage 5. Birth WH and yes or no questions formed. Are these your boots? Does daddy have a box? Stage 6. Children are able to correctly form question types, including negative and complex embedded questions. Competence and performance. Forster and Cohen, 1999, that the system of knowledge underlying language production might be rather different from, in fact, much more complicated than what children actually say is captured in the construct between competence and performance, a distinction Noam Chomsky introduced to modern linguistic discussion. Something that teachers have known for centuries, but which linguists have been much slower to acknowledge is that people value and their control over the language. Some people, perhaps more highly educated, more widely read, more intelligent by certain measures, have larger vocabularies and access to a wider range of expressions. Others have specialized vocabularies and ways of speaking for specific subfields of human endeavor, computers, skateboarding, mathematics, cursing. Others too are more fluent at using their language, more persuasive, more elegant, more precise. Some view languages as more central to their lives than others and pass their attitude and language practices on to subsequent generations. Chomsky, 1965, a grammar of a language purports to be a description of an ideal speaker hearer's intrinsic competence. Its grammar is furthermore perfectly explicit. In other words, if it does not rely on the intelligence or the understanding of the reader, but rather provides an explicit analysis of his contribution, we may call it a generative grammar. A fully adequate grammar must assign to each of an infinite range of sentences a structured description, indicating how this sentence is understood by the ideal speaker hearer. This is a traditional program of descriptive linguistics, and traditional grammars give a wealth of information concerning structured descriptions of sentences. For example, I persuaded a specialist to examine John. I persuaded John to be examined by a specialist. I expected the specialist to examine John. I expected John to be examined by a specialist. Pinker 1999 provided a description of these properties. Phonology, rules that define the sound patterns of a language. Lexicon, stored entries for words including irregulars. Morphology, rules for forming complex words including regulars. Syntax, rules for forming phrases and sentences. Finally, semantics, meanings expressed through language. A third language acquisition. For example, German-Turkish bilinguals. A foreign accent stems from different linguistic features that are transferred from one language to another. L2. Their features are manifold and can concern prosody, intonation, voice quality, and more. Whether or not speaker has a foreign accent in an L2 may depend on several factors, such as the age of onset, the amount of continued L1 use, the amount of L2 use, or the identification with the society speaking the L2. Our study set out to explore the question of whether early successive Turkish-German bilinguals will have a native accent in one or both of their languages, or whether a native accent in one language implies a foreign accent in the other language. SLA researches, Alice. SLA is used as a general term that embraces both untutored acquisition and tutored acquisition. SLA researchers have only recently turned their attention to how learners acquire the ability to communicate and started to examine how learners use their knowledge to communicate their ideas and intentions. Classroom-based research. A high proportion of recent classroom-based research has become focused on learner-learner interactions during tasks, thereby building upon earlier cross-experimental studies of native-non-native speaker interaction. A task that entails an information gap between interlocutors that is unfamiliar to them, that engage learners in social exchanges about shared goals and problems, that is undertaken by learners of different levels of proficiency, and that demands a single correct solution for successful comparison appears to encourage learners to have longer times, produce more complex language, and devote more time to explicit negotiation for meaning than any other kinds of task. Instructed SLA. The debate concerning the effectiveness of L2 instruction takes place at two fundamental levels. At the first level, SLA theories address in absolute terms any potential at all for even the best possible instructional intervention in SLA. A small number of SLA researchers claim that instruction can have no effect beyond the provision of an environment to conduct conducive to SLA. At the second level of debate, a case is made for the benefits of instruction, then assuming the effectiveness and sometimes even necessity of relevant and principled instruction, researchers investigate the comparative efficacy of different types. A fundamental question in this second line of research is whether adult SLA involves in the main implicit or explicit language processing, and the related question of whether the most effective instruction is implicit or explicit. Implicit and explicit learning. Several recent literature reviews provide an overview concerning the role of a number of related concepts, such as consciousness, awareness, attention, noticing, and focus on form, and second language learning. As these literature reviews show, a considerable amount of work suggests there is a positive role for some kind of attention to form, that is, either through the explicit teaching of grammar and explicit error correction, or at least through more indirect means such as improved enhancement. These literature reviews also make it clear, however, that relatively few studies have consisted of a direct comparison of implicit and explicit learning, everything else being the same. The definition of implicit learning has something in common with the well-known problem of defining intelligence. Just as intelligence researchers first developed a number of predictive tests and only later studied warring average psychological mechanisms that determine performance on such tests. And the literature in implicit learning reflects an early focus on certain tasks and subsequent attempts at analyzing the learning rate and the retrieval mechanisms that explain this performance and at defining their fundamental nature. Implicit learning. We argue that the learning sciences are poised for a decade of synergy. We focus on several key traditions of theory and research with the potential for mutually influencing one another in ways that can transform how we think about the science of learning, as well as how future educators and scientists are trained. The three major strands of research that we focus on are implicit learning and the brain, informal learning, and design for formal learning and beyond. On proficiency, the implicit conception of language proficiency as it has been operationalized in second language classrooms has entailed viewing proficiency as little more than grammar and lexis. The recent movement toward communicative language teaching has been associated with a broader view of language that includes not just its grammatical aspects, but also the ability to use language appropriately in different contexts and the ability to organize one's thoughts through language. Guns and Selinker. Guns and Selinker define a second language acquisition. It is a study of how learners create a new language system with only limited exposure to a second language. It is a study of what is learned of a second language and what is not learned. It is a study of why most second language learners do not achieve the same degree of knowledge and proficiency in the second language as they do in their native language. It is also the study of why only some learners appear to achieve native-like proficiency in more than one language. In that sense, language teaching methods are different from those acquisitions in learning. As an effective teaching method, the input hypothesis has been set. Pedagogy. For the centuries spanning the mid-1980s to the mid-1980s, the language teaching profession may be aptly characterized by a series of methods that rose and declined in popularity. It appears that some practitioners in this time period hoped to define the ultimate method, one that would be generalizable across widely varying audiences, contexts, and languages. Methodology, pedagogical practices in general, whatever considerations are involved in how to teach a methodological approach, theoretically well-informed positions and beliefs about the nature of language, the nature of language learning, and the applicability of both to pedagogical settings. Method, a generalized set of classroom specifications for accomplishing linguistic objectives. Curriculum, specifications for carrying out a particular language program. Technique, any of a wide variety of exercises, activities, or tasks used in the language classroom for realizing lesson objectives. To a communicative way in language use. Communicative language teaching. The learning activities themselves are pre-communicative rather than communicative. That is, they aim to equip the learner with some of the skills required for communication, without actually requiring him to perform communicative acts. The criterion for success is therefore not so much whether he was managed to convey an intended meaning, but rather whether he has produced an acceptable piece of language. However, by emphasizing the communicative nature of this language, The activities also aim to help the learner develop links with meaning that will later enable him to use this language for communicative purposes. The term practice as used here include not only activities where the learner's response is expected to be immediate, as in most stories and question-answer practice, but also those where the learner has more time to reflect on the operations he is performing, is as in most written exercises. Linguistic competence. Success in doing tasks involves more than linguistic competence in one sense and less in another. It involves more in that the process of understanding, thinking, and stating outcomes which are necessary in accomplishing the task are supported by various non-linguistic resources such as those of practice listening and numeracy. They are also supported by the way tasks are structured, with the limitation of possible interpretations and outcomes, always parallel instances. On the other hand, success in doing tasks involves less than linguistic competence in that, strictly speaking, language needs to be comprehended only for a certain purpose and the outcome needs to be formulated in language only to the extent necessary for putting its meaning content across. Now, linguistic competence involves not just being able to communicate meaning, but in that process conforming to linguistic norms as well. Also, learners in a task-based classroom can get their meaning across by means of ungrammatical expressions. Task-based teaching is meant to enable them to achieve in due course grammatical conformity in their use of language. The acquisition learning hypothesis. Language acquisition is a subconscious process while it is happening. We are not aware that it is happening. Also, once we have acquired something, we are not usually aware that we possess any new knowledge. The knowledge is stored in our brains subconsciously. The research strongly supports the view that both children and adults can subconsciously acquire language. Also, both oral and written language can be acquired. In non-technical language, acquisition is sometimes referred to as picking up a language. Language learning is what we did in school. It is a conscious process. When we are learning, we know what we are learning. Also, learned language is represented consciously in the brain. In non-technical language, when we talk about rules and grammar, we are usually talking about learning. I define direct grammar instruction here as consisting of two components, focus on form and presentation of the rule. Altogether, we should ask ourselves what is the value of grammar instruction, if any, in the face of what we know about L2 development. This question has met with diverse answers in the field of SLA. Some experts question the value of instruction based on the widely felt gap between the classroom and the outside the world. If you have ever learned or taught a foreign language in the classroom, you too will no doubt remember many times when what was learned through grammar explanations and conscious effort did not transfer well to spontaneous, idiomatic usage in real-world situations. This was Krashen's position when he distinguished between learning or conscious knowledge obtained through grammar study and acquisition or the incidentally developed ability to use an L2 fluency naturally. He claimed that learning cannot become acquisition. Syllabus. Grammatical syllabus is the most common. During the 1970s, the use of structured syllabuses came under increasing criticism. Both task-based and procedural syllabuses share concern with the classroom processes which stimulate learning. They therefore differ from syllabuses in which the focusing on the linguistic items the student will learn or the communicative skills that they will be able to display as a result of instruction. In both approaches, the syllabus consists not of a list of items determined through some form of linguistic analysis, nor of a description of what learners will be able to do at the end of the course of study, but of the specification of the task or activities that learners will engage in class. Course planning and syllabus design. A number of different levels of planning and development are involved in developing a course or a set of instructional materials based on the items and objectives that have been established for the language program. A syllabus describes the major elements that will be used in planning a language course and provides the basis for its instructional focus and content. Tasks are activities that drive the second language acquisition process. Grammar teaching is not central with this approach because learners will acquire grammar as a byproduct of carrying out tasks. Tasks are motivating for learners and engage them in meaningful communication. Long clocks. Type A syllabuses focus on what is to be learned. The L2, they are interventionists. Someone pre-selects and pre-digests the language to be taught, dividing it up into small pieces and determining learning objectives in advance of any constellation of who the learners may be or of how language are learned. Type B syllabuses, on the other hand, focus on how the language is to be learned. They are non-interventionist. They involve no artificial pre-election or arrangement of items, and allow objectives to be determined by a process of negotiation between teacher and learners after they meet as the course evolves. A variety of units, including word, structure, notion, function, topic, and situation, continue to be employed in synthetic type A syllabuses. Task has more recently appeared as a unit of analysis on three analytic type B alternatives: procedural, process, and task syllabuses. Each of these has certain limitations too, but when the task syllabus is combined with focus on home in task-based language teaching, the task received more support in second language acquisition research as a viable unit around which to organize language teaching and learning opportunities. How the language is to be learned. Long. Task-based language teaching, TBLT. The tasks are used as the content of task syllabus, which consists of a series of progressively more complex pedagogic tasks. Pedagogic tasks are the activities and materials the teachers and or students work on in the classroom or the instructional environment. Task is a unit of analysis throughout the design, implementation, and evaluation of the TBLT program, including the way student achievement is assessed by task-based criterion reference performance tests. TBLT is an analytic approach with a focus on. Target task can be defined as performance tests. The purpose of the study adapts task-based language teaching and learning to advanced language use. It is applied in writing assignments which have tasks designed to write an email and a narrative story. The task design has target languages that are given as explicit instruction to the classroom. It is based on focus on home approach. Language structures, forms, and vocabularies are examined at the writing task. Benefits of the study. Writing tasks should contain the instruction of focus on forms because forms are meaningful as literacy. Writing tasks can become activities and exams on the way that they prove out what learners have already learned. Classroom activities differ from assignments that will reveal learning outcomes. Research questions. First, can the task design as writing assignments examine what learners have learned when it is given by a teacher having an intention on learning with the instruction of grammar translation? Second, does the task design as writing assignment have the major effect on acquiring target languages for advancing writing literacy? Third, Is there a difference in the task design as writing assignments for developing thinking abilities or intellectual development as problem solving? Task-based language teaching, long. TBLT starts with the task-based need analysis to identify the target tasks for a particular group of learners, what they need to be able to do in the new language. In other words, task in TBLT has its normal, non-technical meaning. Tasks are the real-world activities people think of planning, conducting, or recording their day. That can mean things like preparing breakfast, reading a newspaper, taking a child to school, responding to email messages, making a sales course, attending to a lecture or business meeting, having lunch with a colleague from work, helping a child with homework, coaching a soccer team, and watching a TV program. Some are mundane, some are complex, some require language use, some do not. In TBLT, real learner-centeredness is addressed first and foremost in the cognitive domain. Samada and Bygate. In talking about the role of tasks in second language learning, the aim of second foreign language teaching is to develop the ability to use a target language. Any language learning tasks will be reinterpreted by a learner in his or her own terms. Pedagogically, it is important for teachers to know what aspects of the language are being targeted, whether in terms of product or processes, since without this knowledge awareness, they cannot prepare and brief the students or provide relevant feedback. It is essential that we study how learners respond to and engage with tasks, and how they modify and reinterpret the work plan themselves. A task is used to create some challenge aimed at promoting language development. Skinhan. Two operating methods of implemented tasks have been proposed, which differ in the way they relate tasks to specific language structure. The first approach enables planning and systematic treatment of language, while the second maximizes the communicative attractiveness of tasks. Structure-oriented tasks. Some investigators have proposed that teaching activities can be designed which constrain language use in such a way that specific structures will be used. Communication-driven tasks. The constructing position within a task-based pedagogy is to argue that given learners tasks to transact will drive forward language development. The tasks themselves will create a need for language change and a means of fulfilling that need. Pedagogy, Brandon, Bygate, and Norris, 2009. Today, task-based language teaching is being promoted in many countries around the globe as a potentially very powerful language pedagogy, claimed to stimulate the second language development of both children and adults. At the same time, the empirical evidence that documents how and to what extent task performance can promote language learning is steadily growing and diversifying. Most scholars, curriculum developers, and language teachers will agree that the basic aim of second foreign language teaching is to enable students to use a target language for functional purposes. However, with regard to how second foreign language teaching should be organized so as to optimally promote language development, there appears to exist far less consensus. Curriculum syllabus and task design. TBLT in its fullest sense transcends the scope of teaching methodology by articulating a variety of principles to the design of language educational courses and programs. In practical terms, programs proceed on the basis of curriculum, syllabus, and task design, with key decisions about pedagogy, materials, and assessment being taken along the way. Thus, at the minimum, some kind of language learning targets or outcomes must be identified for particular learners and programs that reside within a specific institutional and social context. Robinson. Syllabus design is based essentially on the decision over the unit of classroom activity and the sequence in which they are to be performed, and these two decisions have consequences for the role of the learner in assimilating the language encountered in the classroom. Task-based approaches differ from language-based approaches to syllabus design. Both materials, syllabus design, are decisions about task content, which begin with collection language input data relevant to target task performance. Learning in TBLT. A task will be given an achievement progress to the extent that it is interpreted by learners as directly dealing with the present state in their knowledge and abilities in the language, and the extent to which it offers real progress in clear relation to this knowledge and ability. Learners' assumptions about their knowledge and abilities may well be divergent with external criteria. Actual nature of the target language and its use, for instance, but it's precisely these assumptions which generate the learner's views concerning what they need to learn in future. The challenges of integrating focus on harm within tasks. A differentiation has been made between focus on harms and focus on harm in tasks. While focus on harm is generally taken to refer to drawing student attention to linguistic items that arise naturally while they are engaged in meaningful communication. Focus on harms involves the pre-selection and specific features based on the linguistic syllabus and the intensive and systematic treatment of those features. In many teaching contexts, the latter results in presentation practice production approach, often pursued by teachers who believe in language learning as a process of building up grammar blocks. For many teachers, this is the unchallenged routine they are familiar with, often required to subscribe to this approach by teacher trainers. As we know from teachers' case studies in our project, from the perspective of the developing teacher, this may result in the feeling of control and safety, so there is no need to change it. From other task implementation teacher development studies, we know that non-native speech teachers of English face a number of challenges in the ELF classroom. Task-based language teaching has been one of the most influential approaches to second language education since the early 90s, and evidence for the impact of task on language learning is growing. The implementation of task-based principles in actual classroom practice, however, is challenging for many teachers. The frequent implementation of the core principle focus on harm is not likely due to transfer from other approaches, as it is unique to TBLT. Other facilitative factors for teachers without TBLT experience may be some familiarity with their role in focus on harm, which requires them to briefly pay attention to language and draw learners' attention to whom. The question remains then why the value attributed to attention to whom did not translate in teaching grammar points or vocabulary items, that is, in focus on whom. Shintani says, I first tried out TBLT with older children, as it seems earlier to do so with students who already had some basic grammar and vocabulary knowledge of English and the ability to produce some English. In one lesson, I used a task I called the map task. This involved the students working in pairs. Each member was given the same map, but only one of them had a starting point, goal, and route marked on the map. What impressed me was how well the students were prepared to cope with the problems the map task posed. This was particularly evident when the students realized that their maps contained some differential problems. They did their best to use their limited English proficiency to deal with these problems, When making their own map task in pairs, they mostly use Japanese but could switch it into English at times. However, when they started to work on the map task created by different pairs, they only used English. Focus on forms. A strong claim has been made that focus on form may be necessary to push learners beyond communicatively effective language toward targets like second language abilities. It may be part of a more efficient language learning experience in that it can speed up natural acquisition processes. The phrase form-focused instruction is variously used to denote the teaching of linguistic forms in isolation, as well as to describe teaching that integrates attention to forms, meaning, and use, a way of organizing language instruction. The benefits of rule explanation in combining with input processing instruction in helping learners develop automatic access to the target language rule in comprehension and production tasks. The focused instruction equips the learners to notice language forms that they did not notice when they focus on meaning. Kashiwagi and Ito said, Nakamori stated, human cognitive development requires that explicit grammar instruction should be given if and only if the learner has matured enough to possess abstract rules. The present study promotes this last option for young adolescent learners. Age 12 and 13, taking the FS that the student come to possess into consideration. Using an explicit grammar explanation in an inductive way is also heightened by eliciting the students noticing the patterns. For the most part, we take into account the instance to rules, which improves procedural knowledge. The teacher must ensure that students do not rely on the rule, but that they instead use imitating, repeating, borrowing, and replacing parts of chunks to form language throats that students can access rapidly. The grammar rule lines can be used by students to express their own ideas. Goromi and Tabeli, untested areas in focus on harm. Recognition of the fact that meaning processing are not adequate for learning a second language and the need for a certain amount of focus on home, and corrective feedback have called linguistics for an integration of meaning focused and focus homed instruction. Longwood believes that attention to home should be incorporated with meaning focused activities and calls this approach focus on home. Abashan and Puchani. They observed that explicit instruction is more effective than implicit instruction. In general, the findings propose that explicit FOF instruction is more operational than implicit FOF instruction. Also, it was found that FOF that is integrated into a meaningful context is as operational as instruction that involves focus on homes. Writing. Manchon. The ultimate aim of the present correction is to advance our understanding of written language learning in an additional language, L2, by exploring together two general dimensions of L2 writing. On the one hand, the manner in which second or foreign L2 users learn to express themselves in writing. The learning to write dimension, and on the other, the way in which the engagement with L2 writing tasks and activities can contribute to development in areas other than writing itself. The learning to learn dimension, be it content knowledge, learning to write content, WLC, or language knowledge and skills, learning to learn language. These three perspectives traverse L2 learning scholarship and practice, although they have developed almost independently from each other, have been informed by different theoretical frameworks, and have resulted in different pedagogical procedures. Based on the various data sources, we interpret the reported changes in the participant task conceptualization at the product and process level at the outcome or the combined effect of the interaction received, which include explicit interaction on academic writing and their extensive and varied writing practice. This interaction between learner factors and instructional factors offers further empirical support to the findings obtained by Wolfsberger in fighting perhaps the most comprehensive study on task conceptualization to date. Our findings also support recent claims of the need to open the task-based language learning and teaching research agenda to the investigation of the insider dimension of tasks, which would include issues of task conceptualization, task complexity, and task difficulty. Our suggestion would be that these issues are worth investigating also with respect to writing and not only for pedagogical purposes related to task design and task sequencing constraints, but also for theoretical and pedagogical reasons related to the language learning potential that tasks, in our case, writing tasks can afford. In two-way dynamic encapsulated. One should expect new insights to come from writing that can enhance our understanding and use of tasks, and one should also expect insights that have informed TBLT to be beneficial for our understanding of the learning and teaching of writing. Our claim is that there is a difference between incorporating writing tasks into educational practice and purposefully probing into how central qualifiers of L2 writing might be theorized through unexpensive, though at the same time well-specified construct of tasks for language learning. We identify and briefly address three prominent areas: problematizing central tenets in mainstream TBLT scholarship, expanding the palette of tasks and task-related concerns to theoretical predictions that can and should be empirically investigated, and reconfiguring TBLT research methodological procedures, most prominently in the area of writing, but perhaps also elsewhere. Writing is a complex cognitive activity that entails continuous decision-making and problem-solving processes at different levels. The writer's problem-solving activities for composing has been acknowledged as resulting from the interaction between task-related factors and learner-related factors. Task-related factors are subsumed under the general heading of the task environment. Learner-related factors include everything the writer brings to the task. A central tenet in TBLT theorizing is the close connection between the student's engagement with the pedagogic task on the one hand and potential language learning outcomes on the other. Theoretical predictions regarding the interaction between task factors and individual learner factors in explaining the effects of task demands and the potential of task learning need to take account of the idiosyncrasy of task-related variables in writing. Coding languages, FL programs, almost without exception, incorporate learning objectives related to the development of writing competencies, as well as curricular guidelines concerning the typology of text. Students are expected to be able to write during a given instructional period, and the way in which the learning and teaching of such text should be sequenced and implemented. Writing should not be considered a mere form of language practice. Instead, the role of writing in language learning is much more encompassing and hence considerably more relevant than what may be inferred from well-established accounts of what L2 learning entails, how it develops, and how it should be fostered in the classroom. The indirect learning outcomes result from the engagement in the set of crucial learning processes that writing facilitates because of its pace, permanence, and problem-solving nature. Macron argued that research into the relationship between strategic behavior and task demands additionally needs to take into account different levels of linguistic knowledge in order to determine what resources individuals are able to draw upon during task performances. The study attempts to demonstrate how strategic behavior is variably applied when linguistic knowledge does not adequately meet task requirements. Meaning is communicated in context to fulfill the writing task requirements in the given context. Writing tasks require writers to consider their own current linguistic knowledge and their own knowledge of the writing genre, as well as the availability of external support sources such as dictionaries, glossaries, and so on. In manipulating the components of writing tasks during each of the writing processes, all writers adopt some levels of strategic behavior in order to achieve the goal of task completion. Writing researches, culture, context, and writing. I am concerned with one aspect of the relationship between language and culture, interaction of cultural meaning and rhetorical style in the written mode across languages, traditions of literacy. This area of research developed out of pedagogical constraints related to writing by international students in English as a second foreign language. The suggestion to foster an awareness of different rhetorical styles among English educators is motivated by two major considerations. First, in view of the findings of research on socialization through language, it is not possible to train the entire English-using population of the world to the way of thinking and writing in American, British, or any other variety of English. Furthermore, the teaching of rhetoric, an American institution not shared by all native English-speaking countries, seem to reflect an idealized notion of what an ideal English program or composition is. Academic writing. Academic writing as a genre has been analyzed from various perspectives. Swells approaches academic writing as a socio-rhetorical discourse accepted in a community of writers and leaders who function within a framework of communicative goals, conventions, socialization processes, and solidarity moves. Atkinson points out that the superordinate notion of scientific objectivity, at least partly conventional in origin, can be reflected. How the author approaches and develops the topic, follows written discourse paradigms, and employs syntactic and referential markers. Written communicative paradigms represent a convergence of different stylistic, cultural, religious, ethical, and social notions, all of which comprise written discourse notion frameworks. The writer does not need to prove to be knowledgeable because by virtue of writing the text, the author is assumed to have authority, credibility, and knowledge. Strategies for conveying objectivity and credibility, as reflected in Anglo-American academic writing, are emphasized in the teaching of L2 writing. L2 instructional methodologies often incorporate the notion of rhetorical objectivity, proofing, persuasion, and supported argumentation. Text as discourse, while as autonomous model views text as forms which can be analyzed independently of any real-life uses. Another way of seeing writing as a material thing looks beyond surface structures to see text as discourse. The way we use language to communicate, to achieve purposes in particular situations. Here the right is seen as having certain goals and intentions, and the ways we write our resources to accomplish this. So instead of forms being disembodied, independent of context, a discourse approach sees them as located in social actions. Teachers following this line before therefore aim to identify the way that text actually work as communication by linking a language forms to purposes and context. A variety of approaches has considered text as discourse, but all have tried to discover how writers organize language and to produce coherent, purposeful prose. A different strand of research has tried to identify how writers organize units of text to help the reader see how the purpose of the message is unfolding by examining what piece of text are trying to do and how they fit into a larger structure. Reading and writing. This brief commentary offers a sense as to why they chose to emphasize reading and writing connections from the perspective of how reading played an active role in the writing classroom. A critical move at the time when, as they point out, auto-writing teachers tended to assume that reading should be taught separately from writing, and taught by reading teachers, not writing instructors. Text as a source of literate knowledge, reading patterns in L1 and L2 literacy development, reading ability, writing proficiency, and interlingual transfer, reading and writing models, tools for teachers. One of the most challenging aspects of auto-writing instruction for many teachers appears to be accounting for reading in a meaningful way. Narratives. In a formal learning context, the teacher presents the learner with a formal abstract, objective statement of an everyday concept that the students bring with them to the classroom. In this case, definition of plural structures is linked with the experience of memorable, rhythmic phrases. The intellectual process that follows as the two manifestations of the concept interact takes the learner through a series of transformations that the learner builds a conscious understanding of the patterns and relationships expressed in the concept of parallelism. The learner who has repeated or imitated the words in the specific definition of the concept gradually began to use the words with the same meaning as the teacher so that the words comprise similar, if not exactly the same, sets of categories, relationships of implications. Creating context is one of the biggest challenges beginning writers face. Toward a more comprehensive view, the relationship between experimental and analytic activities in the classroom has recently emerged as one of the key issues in second language pedagogy. Writing assignments. Assignments placed in the self category, although required by the teacher, were not formally graded. Methodology. First, the learners are set at B1. Tasks are designed with target languages including negation, embedded questions, and quantifiers. Tasks are given as writing assignments. Here is a task design from Unit 1 Restaurant to Unit 14 Education. This is a data analysis of Task 1. This is a data analysis of Task 2. To evaluate research questions, can the task design as writing assignments examine what learners have learned when it is given by teacher having an intention on learning with instruction of grammar translation? I said before. Discussion 1 paraphrase. A. Target tasks are completed more in meaning than in forms. B. Forms might be in storage at the level of meaning of L1. C. In tasks, target language are not acquired, but target tasks are achieved in L2. Target tasks are completed more in meaning than in forms. For example, the Vietnam restaurant that you asked me to arrange is available. It's possible to reserve the Vietnam restaurant, which was recommended by my friend. Embedded questions. When you have a chance, please let me know which place I should call. Please tell me which you'd like by tomorrow. B. Forms might be in storage at the level of meaning or L1. Miss Sobri, an English teacher, participated in 110 minutes lecture. The English teacher named Miss Sobri joined 110 minutes lecture. C. In task target language are not acquired, but target tasks are achieved in L2. No one had a notebook or laptop. There was no one who had a notebook and a computer. The result of data analysis, target tasks are completed in L2. The explicit instruction of focus on harm is not effective. Mental risk score. The finding is that L2 writers paraphrase target forms in writing tasks. Lexical storage and lexical access. The psychology of words and word meaning makes an important distinction between lexical storage, how words are stored in our minds in relation to each other. Lexical access, how we reach the word when we need it. Words are not stored in the mind independently. On the contrary, every content word appears to have cross link to others. Meaning. What is the knowledge that we have about the language we speak? Quite simply, our vocabulary and the ways to use it. More specifically, we have two vocabularies, an active vocabulary that we use in producing utterances, and somewhat larger passive vocabulary that we need for understanding a variety of people. Vocabulary learning. Cognitive cost appears to influence student strategy use in learning L2 vocabulary words for tests. In particular, three aspects of student test behavior and questionnaire responses indicate this cognitive cost influence. First, the use of repetition and shallow processing strategies was prevalent in both the first and second tests. Second, the level of effort the students reported using was on average low. Third, the majority of students could think of better strategy to use, but they subsequently did not use those strategies. Jones asks the questions to vocabulary researchers. Does vocabulary acquisition improve when learners exercise more choice in vocabulary learning? What does depth of cognitive processing contribute to vocabulary learning? The study has attempted to categorize patterns of vocabulary inferencing strategies employed by the L2 learner, understand the role of context on the strategies, and examine the influence of teaching explicit inferencing strategies. Construction. The notion of construction has a time-honored place in linguistics. How and when can grammar be taught? Hopefully, we are in agreement that we would want to see evidence in our learners of a development in their use of the language over time through their spoken and written productions. The debate in language teaching circles appears to have been not about whether grammar should be learned, but whether it should be taught. Developing grammar through natural interaction, developing grammar through implicit home-focused exposure and practice, developing grammar through the explicit teaching of grammar rules. Teaching grammar in context. In textbook, grammar is very often presented out of context. Learners are given isolated sentences, which they are expected to internalize through exercises involving repetition, manipulation, and grammatical transformation. These exercises are designed to provide learners with homework, declarative mastery, but unless they provide opportunities for learners to explore grammatical structures in context, they make the task of developing procedural skills, being able to use the language for communication, more difficult than it needs to be because learners are denied the opportunity of seeing the systematic relationships that exists between home meaning and use. Discussion 2, mistakes. There are mistakes in writing task 1. For example, every agreement and single plural words. There are mistakes in writing task 2. The mistakes in articles much. Language transfer, ordering. When people hear a speaker with a foreign accent, they often try to guess the speaker's background. Russian. The following passage comes from the manual to train English-speaking actors in the use of different foreign accents, in this case, a Russian one. Developmental errors. The error analysis of the 1960s and 1970s shows that some types of errors are common in the emerging second language of speakers of virtually any native language. For many researchers, such errors are nothing more or less than indicators of developmental processes found in both first and second language acquisition, and accordingly, such errors are often termed developmental errors. Definiteness. For example, our student made a mistake. Miss Sober, who is our English teacher, attended the lecture. Denoting. Rather assuring that denoting has complexities in defining objects and needs propositions and knowledge through anaphoric reference. Presupposition. Storotron also represents that identifying a reference is to identify knowledge and a presupposition, saying that everyone has knowledge of the existence of various particular things, each of which he is able, in one sense or another, though not necessarily in every sense, to distinguish from all other things. Tokens indicate that differential meaning to define something is one of properties of definiteness. Anaphor. Gunther Hedberg and DeKeyser note that he allowed careful anaphoric references. George ate an apple last night, but it was much too acid for his liking. Information structure. DeKeyser et al. Developed the discourse structure with information structure and illustrate that opening the file in discourse with presuppositions and anaphora as a base of the given information, which refers to the accessibility to reference and the inference to what is said in discourse. Examples of determiners. There is specific, having a meaning of existence. Yamanashi indicates that Japanese negative expression nai and positive expression aru. I do not have money. There is no bank in this town. Negative items. Discussion 3, assessment. The use of assessment to promote learning has gained considerable traction in second or additional language education in the past 20 years. Terms such as assessment for learning, dynamic assessment, embedded assessment, formative assessment, learning-oriented assessment, and teacher assessment appear in research and professional journals regularly. Classroom-based assessment can take many forms and serve many purposes. Traditionally, summative assessment or assessment of learning is distinguished from formative assessment or assessment for learning. Training teachers. At the general level, language teachers' principal aim is to create powerful language learning environments for all their students. Language use in language tasks. In order to utilize the notion of language use task in the design and development of language tasks, we need to describe what we mean by this term. We can begin our discussion of language use task with a definition of task given by the psychologist John B. Carey in discussing cognitive abilities. The individual must understand what sort of result is to be achieved, and the individual needs to have some idea of the criteria by which performance will be assessed. Danlowski, Lawson, and MacDonald. Learning and retaining class material is not only the primary goal in many class exercises, but may be essential for successfully mastering more complex lessons. To memorize sentence test, it leads to the low accuracy. Discussion for task instructions. Feedback. My thesis is that grammar correction has no place in writing courses and should be abandoned. The reasons or research evidence shows that grammar correction is ineffective. This lack of effectiveness is exactly what should be expected, given the nature of the correction process and the nature of language learning. Grammar correction has significant harmful effects, and the various arguments offered for continuing it all lack merit. First, there is a body of research work that examines the progress of students over time in written accuracy when they receive error feedback. Task repetitions. The term task repetition does not refer to the precise repetition of the language used. Tasks are by definition unscripted, which means that when a task is repeated, participants choose their own language to express their meanings, and this language can vary. Indeed, the sequence of utterance types can also vary. Rather, what is repeated is a given configuration of purposes and a set of content information. Memory and learning. The study of memory and learning arose from philosophical questions regarding how people come to know things about their world. Learning is assuredly the primary way we acquire knowledge, and remembering is the primary means by which people support knowledge claims. Memory. The purely human side of science making can be divided into two separate but intertwined branches. One consists of making up and answering for questions about the domain of interest. The most basic form of this kind of question is what is X, where X stands for any one of very large number of words or expressions. Conclusion. The implementation of target task in TBLT might grow intellectual development on retrieving memory. Writing learning is achieved in L2. If doing so, learning in L2 should be considered at the level of thinking, including problem-solving ability as cognitive aspects. Focus on whom can be effective for advancing literacy or not. It means the possibility of the fact that the second language acquisition has the side of explicit and implicit masteries. The future controversial issue is laid on how the structures, forms, and meanings should be regulated as context or text in the classroom research. The problem of L1 transfer is dealt with the order of acquisition, which proposes a question that the second language acquisition needs propositional knowledge and thinking. As task factors, it should be noted that the task design is too tough or difficult, although it can be achieved. It's the end of the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Kondo Sensei. I was monitoring the chat and it looks like nobody has any direct questions right now, but I would recommend that if anybody wants to continue this conversation, they go into the SIG room in the EventZilla area. I have to close out this room, but then the SIG room will be available for anybody who wants to carry the conversation. And I would also ask everyone to unmute themselves, and let's give Kondo Sensei a nice round of applause. Thank you very much.